Hi there, folks. Dan Footer with Caliber Magazine and your episode of Gunvote for Tuesday, September 7th. That means there are 13 days remaining in this, our 44th federal election. As of the weekend, or as of this morning rather, and the Labor Day long weekend, the polls remain relatively flat, with the Conservatives gaining little to no ground, as well as the Liberals gaining little to slightly more, perhaps, depending on who you believe. With the big movers in the polls generally being the fringe parties, the Greens, the PPC, the Bloc, and the Maverick Party, with perhaps the PPC being the big winner over the weekend, with some polls showing them gaining as much as 4 points, I believe it was. We'll obviously dive into why that was in a little bit, and as always, I'll try and keep this episode pretty brief at the 15 to 20 minute mark, as close as I can. Obviously, the first thing to discuss is if there's any changes or how time has changed the way we look at the Erin O'Toole announcement on the weekend, where he stated that he would retain the restrictions put in place last year, while simultaneously taking the politics out of gun bans in Canada. There has not been any clarification on that. As you can see here, I've pulled up a revised version of the Conservative Party campaign policy book. Prior versions of this document did not include that footnote stipulation that all firearms that are currently banned remain banned. Just like the weekend, there's been no clarification on what that means and how that would potentially play into the classification review that he has also promised to take the politics out of this. In addition to that, MP Rachel Harder released a statement here, apparently having received quite a lot of pushback from concerned gun owners in her riding. The Conservative Party position was softening on this particular issue, so she sought to clarify it by saying that when it comes to the current ban on military-grade weapons, Conservatives will hit the pause button and conduct a full public review of the firearms classification system. Now, she goes on to say that they'll get rid of the politics again, no shady backroom deals, etc. Again, it doesn't seem totally clear as to what that means, what that classification review will do. And here we obviously face the logical problem that people have basically been dancing around, is that the Conservative Party is looking to distance themselves from their previous policy on firearms because they obviously see that there are more votes to be had on the left side of this issue in urban areas such as the GTA, the GVRD, and the Atlantic provinces. Now, in the 2019 election, that was a very good example of the vote inefficiency of the Conservative Party. They absolutely dominated in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, while winning almost nothing in Toronto, and as a result, they lost the election, and subsequently we find ourselves here. So, thus we arrive at the current conundrum faced by most gun owners in this country that are aware of this. And somewhat similarly, the concurrent rise of the PPC, I think, over the weekend. Overall, the Conservative Party absolutely, without a doubt, remains a gun owner in Canada's best choice to remain a gun owner in this country. Justin Trudeau's policy of limiting all magazines for long arms to 5 rounds or less means that pretty much everything will be substantially smaller. The existence of smaller ammunition for 12-gauge shotguns, for example, means that your average duck hunting shotgun will find itself permanently limited to 2 or 3 rounds, depending on what kind of ammunition you shoot, meaning no more wooden dowel. I mean, welded up and enabled of doing anything more than that. So if you like to shoot sporting clays on the weekend and ducks occasionally, you're going to be in some trouble there. So it's going to be tricky to discuss because it's one of those situations where you simply have to accept that it's not the greatest situation, but it's better than the alternatives. And that's truly where we stand. And having seen a lot of the discussion and comments saying that we are conversely stabbing people in the back, be it being stabbed in the back or stabbing the Conservatives in the back if you don't tacitly support them in all things, I think it's important that we understand that it's possible to express displeasure for something while also supporting someone. And that's the sort of situation that I think gun owners find themselves in. As for the rising support for the People's Party of Canada, we've discussed that in the past, but obviously to rehash that just slightly, the PPC, even with these current gains, remains a very, very, very distant 4th, 5th, and 6th place, depending on what riding you look at, meaning that there's pretty much a snowball's chance in hell that any PPC member or PPC candidate will be elected in any given riding. meaning that even if they were to get 1 million votes across the country, evenly spread out across the country, those 1 million votes would be completely wasted. And obviously in a community such as ours, where you've only got 2.3 million people total, we really can't afford to be throwing those votes away so that the people that cast them can feel better about them. We really need people that are going to think about the strategic implications of how they vote and what that might mean in the future. Which brings us around to what the future might actually bring, because we have to confront this issue of what this changing policy from Erin O'Toole might mean. Now, that brings us around to the realities, and the reality of the current situation is that with the polls being so evenly split, we're likely looking at a Conservative minority if the Conservatives are lucky enough to win. If the Liberals win, it's looking most likely like a Liberal minority as well. So with a minority government position, Erin O'Toole would be faced with quite a few issues, primarily a minority following a minority when he would seek a very strong mandate to make significant changes, as well as facing probably a coalition from the Bloc and the NDP and Liberals potentially as necessary on that side of things. But where we get into technical issues is that, well, it would have been probably within his mandate, or conversely, to put it another way, social license, to withdraw that OIC pretty much immediately based on his campaign promise. Walking that campaign promise back and stating that it would have to go through a classification review process does change things slightly, insofar as that would be a very difficult thing to accomplish by OIC. And in a minority government position, he may not have any other legislative tools at his disposal to enact this. If we can all recall back to last May when the OIC was new, undoubtedly many of you, sorry about that if that made some noise, many of you and myself included, saw many newspaper headlines, and myself actually did numerous interviews pointing out that part of the problem with it was it constituted a gross overstepping of the OIC procedures. For those that don't know, OIC is an ordering council. It's essentially the Canadian version of sort of an executive order whereby the Privy Council, which is effectively cabinet and the Prime Minister's office, can essentially edict. They can legislate by edict. Typically, OICs have been most commonly used actually to correct typos and translation errors in legislation that were not deemed to be worthy of the typical amendments to legislation procedures. Obviously, if someone has mistranslated the French word for dog in a piece of legislation, it's not worth having the House and the Senate meet to correct that. You would simply OIC the error out of existence. The gun ban constituted one of the largest OICs probably ever, because it did constitute the seizure of hundreds of thousands of people's property, effectively by edict rather than parliamentary procedure, democracy as we would probably call it. So you can imagine the pushback that the Conservatives would face from a coalition of Bloc, NDP, and Liberal MPs in the House that probably formed a majority of that coalition. The kind of pushback they would face if they were to try and rewrite the Firearms Act and the classification system through an OIC, it would be monumental. And I think most likely that would probably set the stage for another election, because you'd see a lot of public sentiment shift around that. And effectively, we would find ourselves in another election where the ballot box issue would begin and end with the Conservatives want to make guns legal again. So we find ourselves definitely in something of a conundrum, but effectively we're also between a rock and a hard place, because the other alternatives out there are not exactly attractive. Because to be quite clear again, if you look at the polls and you read them with any sense of reality, the only Prime Minister that we will have next will either be Erin O'Toole or Justin Trudeau. In a minority situation, there are some saying that Justin Trudeau may win a minority and then face a leadership challenge of his own, in which he may step down and be replaced by Chrystia Freeland, in which case our next Prime Minister may be Chrystia Freeland. In either case, it will be a Liberal or a Conservative. There will not be an NDP Prime Minister. It simply is they're polling too low, and if the NDP is polling too low to form government, then surely that makes people understand that the PPC is quite simply not a viable option. Now that said, people should probably also relax slightly, because those fringe party polls typically have a result of softening as we near election time. 2 weeks out, with this announcement right here, people are probably answering that question, because remember, polls are not overly scientific in their delivery. They are in their concoction, but when they actually get delivered, they phone you and they just ask you what you think. And if you have just read all this stuff about Erin O'Toole changing his mind, you may answer that phone slightly more emotionally than you might drop your ballot in the box, because there is definitely a different weight, different gravity to that particular situation. So I wouldn't expect the PPC polls to continue rising. I think you'll probably see that support flatten and then slacken off in the next week. I think for the next few days and going into the debate on Thursday, we're going to see a tremendous amount of attacks and pressure put on. I don't think this gun issue is going away. I'm actually doing an interview at 8:05 p.m. Western time here, Pacific time, with CKNW nationally. We were supposed to do a panel with a member from the Doctors for Protection of Guns, where we were going to discuss Erin O'Toole's statement and change. Unfortunately, the representative from the doctors group has elected to, they would rather speak to the host of the show individually, so I will be going and speaking after her at 8:05. So if you guys want to tune in at 8:05 Pacific, that's 3 hours after you guys in the West, so that'll make it 11:05 p.m., and that's available online at CKNW. Just Google it, CKNW. Or if you're in the Vancouver area, that is 980 on the AM dial, where we'll talk a little bit more about this. Tomorrow we'll be back with a guest to, again, probably continue discussing what this means down the road. I'm also going to be on Slamfire Radio tomorrow. We're recording that. I'm not sure when that'll come out, but this will probably come up there too again. And just like we'll be discussing it, I assume that some more in the media probably will as well. So keep your eyes peeled for that. The biggest thing I can tell people is simply calm down. Effectively, if they want to distance themselves from us, then you should absolutely maybe, be a little bit angry about that and let them know, put a little bit of pressure on them so that if they do have the opportunity to form government, they understand that it should be a priority. But with what they're saying now, who knows? It still remains the better option because unless you want to go backwards, someone has to win this thing. There is no option on the ballot for none of the above, as much as we might have perhaps wished so in years past, and perhaps even now in some cases. But you gotta dance with the ones that brung you. And in this case, it's going to be either Justin Trudeau or Erin O'Toole in the next one. So think about that while you guys are discussing stuff. It's certainly disappointing, and I don't think that. I think it's absolutely it's totally normal to be disappointed and frustrated by this, but we also have to be realistic about it. Understand why they did it. Understand that unfortunately, this is the way things work. So I will be back with another episode again. Like I said, tomorrow we're going to be doing it a little bit earlier again. I'll be recording at 8:30 in the morning, and we should have something out in the afternoon as well. I'll be updating for those of you that are listening to this as a podcast. It has populated now through Google Podcasts and all the other various places. So I will be uploading all of those shortly as well, now that it's percolated through. As always, thank you for taking the time to listen. If you'd like to support the coverage here, we've got 2 more weeks of this before we roll into the episodes of Caliber podcasts and videos that I've been recording concurrent to this. Head over to calibermag.ca/subscribe. Pick up a subscription. We've actually had a ton of people sign up, which I appreciate tremendously. It's been a tough year. The last couple of years have been incredibly tough. So it's been really nice to get back down to work after having to take a little bit of time away and see that response. So for you guys that have subscribed, from the bottom of my heart and from all of my family, thank you so much. From anyone that wants to, by all means, head over. We'd love to have you. Next issue is coming out in about a month or so and should have a lot of interesting stuff in there. So I will see you guys tomorrow, hopefully a little bit earlier. Hopefully everyone had a great Labor Day, and have a fantastic evening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.